Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the sun and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Scorpio Sun as the Sect Light, I speak with the astrologer Sam Reynolds. I'm really excited to be dropping this first episode of my Sun series, which will continue for the next year. For new listeners, please go back and listen to the Moon series that I've been doing over the last year, where I spoke to different astrologers about their moon sign. I was excited to speak with Sam because he was the first professional astrologer that I got a reading with, and in that session, he suggested that I do a podcast, which motivated me to start this project. Thanks again for coming onto the show, Sam. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and timing consultations, as well as answering corollary questions. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Sam Reynolds, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing?
I am excellent. Thank you for having me, SP.
It's my pleasure. Just for listeners and watchers, this is going to be the first episode of our Sun series, and it's going to be the first episode that I put the recording, the video, onto YouTube. So just for people who are watching and listening, we're recording on Friday, October 27th at 5:10 p.m. We're technically, I think, still in a void moon, but
Yes, we are.
It's been a very productive void moon for me. And it's also, we're in the midst of eclipse season. We're about to have an eclipse tomorrow. So how has the astrology been for you of late?
It's been pretty good. The void moon, when it started or commenced, a few days ago, Wednesday, it was kind of funny because I had 3 clients, well, 2 students and 1 client lined up, and either they didn't show or had to reschedule or cancel. So that was really interesting because that rarely happens where it's like, there could be in a day, there might be 1, but to have all 3, so it's kind of like a snow day. So that was kind of synchronous with the experience of a void moon. And then from then, it's been chilling, been relaxing, relatively quiet, including today. So I've been enjoying it, which is rare for me because I don't usually have chill.
You would say you're not generally a very chill guy, or
No.
what do you mean by that?
Meaning, like, I think someone pointed out, like, when do you relax? And I'm like, is that a 4-letter word? I mean, I'm learning to, especially being out in the Southwest, but it is not my go-to.
Yeah. The Southwest typically does have a bit of a slower pace. I lived in California for a while, and LA is pretty fast paced, but even there is a bit slower than.
It's slower than New York, and if you step away from LA, you start going toward Joshua Tree or somewhere else. When you get in the desert, you have to slow down.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. I'm glad to hear you've been able to get some rest and some chill. That's wonderful. Sam, can you offer us a short or not so short, if you'd prefer, introduction to yourself in your astrological practice?
Sure. So I'm Sam Reynolds. I came to astrology as a skeptic. I spent 10 years trying to kick the tires of astrology, to deflate them, only to end up an astrologer. I come from, an academic background. I was pursuing my master's and PhD in African American studies. So for me, at the time of my quote unquote discovery of astrology, everything was I looked at it through the prism of race, gender, and class. I'm still attentive to the dimensions of race, gender, and class, especially to questions related to astrology or not. And still committed to the idea of justice and broadening the sense of diversity as we experience it in the general human realm, but also as it relates to astrology itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, what was the thing that made you throw in the towel Like, where did you get into this kind of polemic or like fight with astrology, and what was the thing that ultimately led you to
Oh,
say, okay.
mhm. Excellent question. So I've always wrestled with astrology and even had a dislike for it early on because my birthday is November 22nd. And
Hmm.
so I'm on the putative cusp between Scorpio and Sagittarius.
Hmm.
So when I would look at astrology books, or dream books as my parents had them, which included astrology signs or a breakdown by sign, it was confusing because some would say, up until the 21st for Scorpio, some would say up until the 22nd for Scorpio,
Hmm.
or the beginning of Sagittarius. So I was like, I thought I was clever saying at one point I was a Sagittarius. Um, and then when I became a fundamentalist Christian, I would just say I'm
Mm,
the sign of the cross,
mm,
which again is an interesting parallel to the
yeah.
quote unquote cusp. So I just kind of thought astrology was confusing and astrologers were confused
Mm.
until I, you know, fell hard for a Gemini who piqued my interest, an older Gemini who was wise enough to befriend a young man but not lead him on.
Hmm.
And she was like, "No, I think you're, the Scorpio." And I was like, "Well, if I had to choose between the arachnid or the centaur, clearly I would be a centaur." She's like, "No, you're the bug." So I
Mm,
actually, to make the story a little shorter, I encountered an astrologer in Philadelphia. I was pursuing my master's and PhD at Temple University in
okay.
Philadelphia, and I met this astrologer, and he offered to do my chart for a decent fee. Now, I mean, it wasn't that exorbitant, and I had some extra cash. First thing out of his mouth was like, "Oh, your son is in Scorpio," and I was like, "Okay, this is bullshit already."
Mm,
Um, but then he said something utterly profound related to my family history that I had only learned 2 months before.
oh, wow.
And I was like, "How do you know that?" And he got kind of avuncular about it, and like, "Oh, it's right here, looking at your sun in relation to your moon and Mercury here." And I was like, he said something that, something that happened to my mother related to my mother and my
Mm,
brother and father being
mm,
involved. So that was pretty specific. And I had other readings, like I didn't say this, but I was friendlier to other forms of divination, but for some reason astrology irked me the most.
okay.
And so I was like, that's pretty specific. Why? And I thought it was a trick. So I was determined to uncover his trick. How I got a little deeper into it, I was for some reason talking about my encounter with the astrologer with someone who lived in my graduate housing at the time that I didn't know well. And on a lark, I asked her, "Well, when's your birthday?" And she said, "November 22nd." And I was like,
Wow.
"November 22nd, when?" 1967,
Mm,
which is my exact birthday. And I was just like, she was really into astrology. I was like, wow. So, and I was like, "Can I borrow some books from you then?" And she's like,
hmm,
"Sure, I have lots of books." So it was really interesting to kind of find this parallel out of the blue because it's not too many people I've met who actually have the same birthday as I do, the
mm,
same year.
hmm,
So I had enough respect for, synchronicity or some measure of, things lining up, divine
mm,
alignment, or the idea of alignment. I don't know if I believed in divinity at the time. So I spent 10 years looking at it. And to answer your question, I was in New York. I had moved from Philly to New York, and I was at a Christmas party. And I was talking to this guy about astrology who was trying to debunk it. And he asked me a very simple question after we had, done our rounds of going back and forth about it.
hmm,
And he said, "But you don't believe it, do you?" And I was like, and there was a moment of, registering, like, I think I do. Yeah.
mm,
That I really, after 10 years of kicking it in the teeth or trying to, that I felt like it was valid
mm,
and had learned enough about it to know that, it wasn't a trick,
mm,
at least not in the sense of prestidigitation.
yeah. Very interesting. Do you mind if I share your chart?
No,
No, not at all. Okay.
it's public. Actually, it's on the Astro Data Bank.
Okay. So here's your chart with Pisces rising,
Hmm.
and um yeah, you have the sun and Mercury in the ninth house
Hmm.
of like philosophy, religion, law, in Scorpio. And so I'm just curious with like associations with mind, with the sun and Mercury, both, if there are other topics in your life that you feel you had to kind of like spend a decade digging into, if we think about Scorpio as like the well or the fixed water, like the depths, um, if this is like been a theme in your life.
Absolutely. I mean, also with the Sun Jupiter square.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had a very ninth house life. I mentioned um I was a fundamentalist Christian, but the other part of that is I was a minister
Mm-hmm.
starting at 12 years old.
Yeah.
So ministry, religion is also ninth house.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, I was an academic pursuing my master's and PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So again, at university, ninth house
Mm-hmm.
again. Immediately following, leaving university, I ended up working for a university publisher.
Mm-hmm.
So again, ninth house.
Publishing is ninth house. Yeah.
And then I ended up, you know, after also about into acting and performing and different things, pretty much from 25 um to roughly around 33.
Mm-hmm.
Um I was that, and I was also a tech trainer. I don't know if that counts as ninth house. And then
Mm-hmm.
I became an astrologer, which
Right.
is also ninth house. So it's been a pretty ninth house life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I guess to
Incredible.
answer your question specifically, like what prompts me to dig? This
Mm.
is where it gets into some interesting nuances. I mean, my rising lord, or the lord of my ascendant, is opposite to it, so it's defiant.
Mm.
So it's very resistant to believing just something for the sake of it,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. I noticed that you don't have outers, which is cool. But for those who will look at my chart with outers, Neptune is at 24 degrees of Scorpio. So it does then conjoin my sun. So when I was younger in life, I was pretty gullible
Mm.
in a lot of ways. And so as I got older, that kind of taught me to be less gullible
Right.
and more circumspect.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the need to dig deep and know, like, is that fucking true, is more so the Sun Neptune, then tying in the square to Jupiter as the Lord of the 10th,
Mm-hmm.
as the Lord of the Ascendant, as really to know, like, what is the full merit of something.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. That makes a lot of sense. And so that's how you kind of look at what we would call detriment, or what do you call
Well,
this?
detriment, yeah. So it is detriment. But I do look at detriment as the parallel, maybe opposition to rulership. And rulership, I look at not as just a statement of responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
but a statement of belonging.
Mm.
So when a planet's in detriment, it doesn't feel like it belongs. It's lost that sense of belonging, which goes along with the sense of responsibility, the sense
Mm-hmm.
of resource that one experiences in rulership. And so that Jupiter feels like, well, I'm not just going to trust faith for the sake of faith.
Mm-hmm.
What is really the full nature
Yeah.
and sense of faith?
Mm-hmm.
So it often feels like an outsider, but that outsider forces one to kind of find a different sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just smiling because I'm reminded of I did a chart ruler panel with Catherine Urban, and one of the other panelists was Kira Taborn, who is like your chart twin almost. And she was talking about the same thing of like this kind of, for her, this need for facts,
Uh-huh.
which as a Jupiter Sag rising with Jupiter in Cancer is not something I necessarily relate to. And so it's just, and I remember kind of noting that, and it's just very interesting to think about the differences, um, how these different placements can manifest depending on
Yeah.
the dignity or what have you.
I always have interesting conversations with a Jupiter and Pisces because they really believe.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, or look for deeper recesses of belief.
Mm-hmm.
with that, which is really where we can converge.
Right.
Um, but there are some who are like they're believing. I'm like, well, how do you know that? And that doesn't become just this epistemological need for materialism or empiricism,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of like, well, what it does become this epistemological search for like, well, where do you find your meaning? So if you say
Right.
you find your meaning because like you had an experience,
Mm-hmm.
I never debate experience because I've come to learn and trust experience is its own powerful teacher,
Right.
which is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when we get into a public space of contested space where you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to appeal to a sense of logic or facts,
Mm-hmm.
then that's where we have to have a consensual reality.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, subjective truth is just as legitimate or valuable, or what, I'm not exactly sure what the word is, and all these words have different kind of baggage that they can bring with them or what have you. But yeah, it is just as it's just as important. It's been my personal experience, but there are some real challenges with that. Like
Right.
not, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I'm thinking of like Kierkegaard and like this idea of religious truth being above ethical truth, which can manifest in all kinds of strange ways when people say, God told me to do this, and so therefore I did XYZ. And it's like, okay, well, that's illegal and also unethical, just if we consider any kind of ethical system. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, it is incredibly important, but it is also very fraught, which feels, yeah, the Jupiterian nature of that feels very interesting to me.
And I guess you threw in Mercury and its conjunction to the lot of fortune. You know, I really, since Mercury is the lord of my Jupiter and it does have a wide sextile,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think about my Mercury a lot because, if you use a different um term system, Mercury, I think I'm trying to see because you're using Ptolemaic terms.
If I am, I didn't want to. I'm using Chaldean, but I typically use
You mean use
Egyptian.
Egyptian? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So because my Mercury is in the terms of Mercury. Yeah. So there it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um. So and I'm born on a Mercury day and a Mercury hour, which you have at the bottom left.
Mm-hmm.
Um. And so Mercury does guide me a lot. Like
Yeah.
you and I encountered each other well, I met you at Norwag or became
Mm-hmm.
aware of you um at Norwag, but we've also connected since on Twitter. And I perhaps strike most people. I don't know if I strike you. You can tell me like, no, you're fucking delusional. Um, I seem very mercurial. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's because Mercury on some level, is in his own terms, but it's feral.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you give more credence to this wide square to the moon, as that astrologer did, and also give some credence to Mercury being sextile to Jupiter, which it depends on the orbs you want to use,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like 7 degrees, and some may not want to do that orb. But I think Mercury being conjoined to my secondary ascendant, which is what I called a lot of fortune as well,
Right.
really does give some spin on this need to kind of probe and analyze and play with,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of probably how I dive deeper into astrology as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like we're going off on like a million tangents, but I did all these episodes about this comment that Rob Hand made about Mercury and the Lot of Fortune. You were one of the examples that I used in kind of the research that Mo and I did. Um, and so, just for people who are not familiar, Rob Hand basically said if you have Mercury conjunct the Lot of Fortune, it's a signifier for being a professional astrologer. I have a similar thing, but in a different sign. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is that what they don't tell you when you have Mercury conjunct the Lot of Fortune is that because of how the Lot of Necessity is calculated, that means that you necessarily have your ascendant conjunct the Lot of Necessity, which is not the funnest lot generally. And so I don't know if you have any experiences off the top of your head in relation to how that manifests, but
Well, yeah,
um,
maybe no, I don't, because because I don't, you work with a lot of necessity as much. I know it's calculated there, but so what, I know the classical meaning of necessity, but how do you define a lot of necessity?
I'm mostly familiar with it as there's this astrologer who you probably know named Jake Green who
Yeah,
wrote an
I know
article
Jake.
about it,
Okay.
associates the lot of necessity with Ananke, and so there's this kind of
The mandate of what you must do, your fate.
right, yeah. So there's this kind of like element of, whereas the lot of fortune can be like chance, it's not necessarily good, it's not necessarily bad. There's like an energy that flows around that, which is like the term that you used when I had a reading with you. It's like this kind of whirlpool of
Hmm.
energy in your chart. Then a lot of necessity is like has more of a what's fated, but is a little bit more negative. And so yeah, a lot of people have kind of spoke about that. Whitney Hill and I spoke about that on our last episode a little bit in relation to Mercury and Egyptian astrology. Um, so
Well,
yeah, it's really interesting to
so
consider.
Mercury hasn't, that's interesting because I would say Mercury makes me work for her or his gifts.
Hmm.
Um, so some of the earliest one of the earliest examples I could give you is that I read early in life. I could read, but I didn't always comprehend what I read. Like
Mm,
it was more performative. Like I could read what was written, but like, okay, what did it say? Fucking know,
hmm.
right? I didn't swear, I didn't say
Yeah,
that, but
yeah.
it's kind of like I didn't know. So
Hmm.
even I passed initially kindergarten on condition um, that I would have to improve on my reading,
Mm,
and then I had problems with some measure of enunciation and pronunciation earlier in life. Like I used to say lello for yellow,
hmm. Hmm.
hospitable for hospital. And so I had to work on my diction and enunciation and end up more a public speaker. So it's
Mm,
almost as if whatever is, then going back to astrology, for example, it's almost like, okay, I had to do like not an internship, but indentured servitude or whatever for
mm,
10 years, even though I thought I was like kicking at its teeth, like to really start to understand what astrology really was, this mercurial art.
mm,
So, it's kind of more, you know, Mercury kind of holds the facet as a daemon for me.
mm. And if you could describe for listeners who maybe don't know what that means, what do you mean by
So
that?
the daemon is a tutelary spirit classically that incarnates with you
Hmm.
to keep you honest related to your fate,
Hmm.
to the fate according to the myth of you chose before you incarnated.
Mm,
And even if you don't want to talk about it that way, it becomes way in which you unravel your soul's mission.
mm,
But it's a guiding presence. Some would even say a dimension of your quote unquote higher self that keeps you steadfast to the course.
mm. Wonderful. Thanks for explaining that. Um, I did want to say before we move on that um so I had a reading with you. You were the first person I had a reading an astrological reading with, and it was September of 2021. No, September of 2022. And I'm really excited to have you on because on that, I don't know if this was just kind of like a throw an off the cuff kind of suggestion, but you kind of suggested that I start a podcast, and I had been working in podcasting professionally for a while before that, and I had been kind of thinking about wanting to do something. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And then you kind of threw that out there, and the importance of people hearing my voice is a comment I remember. And so you were really instrumental among many other people. You were very instrumental in me actually starting this. And so I just wanted to thank you for that. I think that I don't know if you have this experience, but I've done some like readings with people, and sometimes you don't hear back from them. You don't know what effect you've had, but yeah, I just want to let you know you had a positive impact on me from that reading, and I really appreciated it. And I'm grateful that we could be here now, like
Yeah.
a year later to do
Yeah.
this.
Thank you, SP. And, per what we just were talking about, one thing that has surfaced more and more in the last, I would say 10 years, because I've been doing astrology for over 30,
Mhm.
is listening to my daemon as I'm doing readings.
Mm,
So what I've learned to do is say what kind of pops in my mind that doesn't seem from my mind,
mm,
um, as it happens. And so I I remember, the podcasting idea. And, this happens every other reading in some sense, not podcasting itself, but something
mhm,
that just flashes in. I don't know where it comes from. I just say it.
mhm,
And it may come to nothing, or
mhm,
I may never know, but I felt like this seemed fitting for
mhm,
you. So
mhm.
I'm glad that it spoke to you, spoke to your heart, spoke to your daemon, and it manifested. So I'm honored to be here and honored to hear what has happened for you. And I think a lot of people have been enriched by it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. To get into the conversation about the sun, I'm just really, I want to hear what you kind of think about the sun and its meaning astrologically. Um, I know that it's kind of like I kind of was a little bit unsure about doing a sun series as a part of this podcast because sun sign astrology is so like popularized and what have you. Um, but I do think that it is really important. Like um, it's like we don't have life without the sun, and we don't have like the animation of our soul without the sun. And so I am just really interested to hear your take on it. But I also just want to point out that like you were talking about having the sun in the ninth and um, Mercury kind of being your daemon. And it's really interesting. The sun is joys in the ninth. The sun is associated with divination. And you basically just talked about the divinatory aspect of astrology in relation or in contrast to kind of the science of knowing what all the things mean, the kind of, and so all of that's coming up, and I'm just interested now in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I definitely see the sun as the fons vitae, as a source of life, the fount of
Mm-hmm.
life. That's literally that Latin phrase for that.
Mm-hmm.
But when I explain to clients by analogy, which I find is a useful tool, um, when I explain to the clients, I've used at least two different analogies that might be instructive on the sun, moon, and rising. But since you're asking about the sun, I'll give all three, but
Okay.
just in context. So one of the earliest ones I used for about 5 years was that the sun is reflective of the soul's intention. So it's like the intention to go to the store to get some milk,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the sun would be reflective of that. The moon would be the vehicle by which you go to the store. It becomes your day-to-day experience of moving toward the store to get this intention or whatever
Mm-hmm.
it is. And then the ascendant will be reflective of the route by which you get to the store to get this intention, or even
Mm-hmm.
the experience of going to the store. Meaning, are you flossing, like, hey, everybody look at me? Or are you trying to be
Uh-huh.
incognito?
Uh-huh.
Or you're taking a very circuitous route? It
Mm.
becomes descriptive of that. So that's the one analogy I've used. The other one most recently is that I describe the sun as the genre,
Mm.
as we might describe literature, or we might describe a film, in cinema.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you the broad expectations by which we might understand the thing, and
Mm-hmm.
so, is it a comedy? Is it more, horror? Is it horror
Right.
comedy? There's some ways and nuances, and the sign
Mm-hmm.
gives us some sense of that. Then the moon becomes more the characters that populate the story
Mm,
and some measure of the mood of the
mhm,
story in terms of how the story is told, even from what position it's told in terms of the point of view. And it gives us some sense of how we enter into the story.
mm,
Then, in terms of the actual arc narrative of the story, then this is the ascendant and this is the rising sign. So
mhm,
this gives us some measure of the movement. So I think of the sun as the broad way by which we can understand something, related to, how we enter into astrology, the
mhm,
space of astrology. Yes, identified often with the concept of the ego, but I
mm,
like Alan Watts's definition of the ego, which is more so the idea that the ego is where we put our attention,
mm,
our focus, sort of like, how we use the sun. I'm speaking to all the young boys out there who burned ants. Maybe there's some young girls there, you know, um, how we kind of focus things. I know that sounds really cruel. Like, what is wrong with you? I'm just talking about being an idiot kid.
yeah.
Um, and doing that. But it is how we might take its magnifying power and where we draw the focus. So I think it is important to talk about what gets focused for Scorpio,
Mhm,
especially as we talk about it through the sun.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, let's get into it. What does get focused for Scorpio? What does the sign of Scorpio mean to you? Um, are you a big myth person? I know that you've talked about you just, mentioned earlier on in the conversation about race, gender, class, like all of these kinds of markers, and myth can be a fraught thing in relation to many of them. So I'm curious if myth plays into your understanding of Scorpio, your understanding of the sun.
Somewhat. I mean, it definitely did, when I ascribed or subscribed to the idea that Pluto ruled Scorpio.
Okay.
Um, I think it does as we think about the nature of Mars
Hmm.
and being in cold, fixed water.
Hmm.
And so it becomes more the emotional. So I think of, we could say Sun in Aries in the sign of Mars relates to more going on the offense,
Hmm.
right? In terms of how one puts oneself out there.
Yeah.
In watery Scorpio, we could talk about the sun going on the defense. So there's a
Hmm.
protective, investigative, circumspect, even suspicious aspect of how we might talk about Scorpio
Hmm.
and related to the nature and the mythology of Mars. But if we talk about mythology in a different way, and I'm still fascinated by all the different ways in which we see Scorpio.
Hmm.
So from the arachnid itself, the scorpion for which it's named,
Hmm.
then the eagle, then the phoenix,
Mm.
then the wolf, which is also associated with Scorpio,
Yeah.
then the snake, also associated with Scorpio.
Hmm.
And I think there's one more, but even just those five, and I actually have a scorpion on my arm. I mean, it's not really, let me
Yeah.
try to angle this right. I won't be
Hmm.
able to do it, but it's a scorpion, um, you know, coming out and then a phoenix rising up. So it was kind of this, especially when I won't say I was more into the mythology, but really tapped into the mythology with a lot more primacy
Hmm.
of the phoenix rising into me and the scorpion coming out.
Mm.
I think I've relaxed a lot on this because I think at the time I subscribed to this model that, you know, that there are different levels or different ways in which we can understand Scorpio. So some people think like, well, there's the petty scorpion, then there's the more elevated, broad-minded
Mm.
eagle, and then there's the more spiritual phoenix. I've come to realize I think that's bunk.
Mm.
Generally, I think on any given day, any particular Scorpio could be any particular one of these animals. If we're
Hmm.
going to talk about it in terms of consciousness,
Right.
and what I would say is the parallel to all of them is how do we refine the instinctual self, the watery self, Scorpion, right?
Hmm.
In some way that has greater catalytic properties of activation and energizing, which catalyzing also taps into anabolic and catabolic processes for something around us. So one of the, I won't say myths, but the images I think about quite often related to Scorpio is not something I've heard too often. Anyone who's seen Sister Act, featuring Scorpio Whoopi Goldberg, I often think about as kind of emblematic of Scorpio. Because here's someone who's on the lam, ends up becoming a nun, right? Not literally, but, kind of as a hustle, right? Trying to hide off, fight from the authorities, who ends up, working with kids, getting them to sing, and becomes this catalyst.
Right.
For the word that now often is associated with Scorpio, transformation. And I think that is at the best of what we can hope for related to Scorpio. I also think of Mahalia Jackson, who used her Taurian voice, right, as the instrument for some measure of a catalyst to initiate, action, and especially being so instrumental during the civil rights movement. His eye is on the sparrow. All these ways, and when we talk about his eyes on the sparrow, again, we have a flying creature trying to get the bird's eye view, which taps into the mystery related to the eagle for Scorpio. And part of being one of the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac, which taps into the Babylonian idea of the Lamassu, the creature that embraces in some different form the 4 animals, classic animals that we also know from the Bible: the lion, the human, the eagle, and the bull. We see the Scorpio deals with it through the power of emotion, seeking certainty, because I think every sign is the answer to the one before it. So the kind of seeking, it's not even balance, but consideration of Libra, the quote unquote at its extreme equivocation, but at its best, it's weighted consideration and thoughtfulness becomes the certain emotional certainty of Scorpio.
Right.
And I mentioned before we started talking, growing up with Libra influenced parents. Mom was a double Libra, sun and moon in Libra. Dad was an Aquarius sun with moon in Libra. And when I often took issue with them, they always seem to emphasize this aspect of consideration. My mom even more so. You're like, well, what do you mean? Like, so for instance, when I would say something so definitively, like it's blah, blah, blah. She said, well, you should say, in your own opinion, it's so-and-so, or say to people, my opinion is, and I thought that was the dumbest thing ever. I was like, well, if they don't know it's my opinion, that's their dumb fault. It's not my fault. Right? Because I'm like, this also sprach Sam Reynolds, quoting what Nietzsche says, thus spoke Zarathustra. Like, well, I just said it.
Yeah.
And I think what they were trying to encourage, with my Scorpio vigor and sensibility of things, Martian, was like, well, how do you take into account others? Right? But Scorpio becomes like the answer. So we have to, and then Sagittarius becomes the answer to that. We're like, maybe you don't fucking know. Maybe you really have to find out. You only feel the truth, not know it. So that's how I've come to think about some dynamic of it. I don't know what else might be entailed related to that mythology or what you meant by the mythology, but that's what I think about. I do try to avoid the seasonal analog, even though it's instructive, because it's limited. Depends on where you are. The seasonal aspect is now we're going toward the tipping point where we have more darkness in the northern hemisphere than we have light. And so Scorpio becomes keenly aware of what is hidden, what is not seen, what is not stated. So it becomes investigative, becomes, curious, and at times paranoid and suspicious related to what is unseen and not known.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about myth in a broad sense because I do think that humans are kind of metaphorical animals,
Hmm.
and astrology is a language that I think is enriched by, like there's so much imagery that's associated with astrology. And so I think story can be really helpful in terms of understanding this kind of language, or however you want to frame it. So in the vast sense of, Whoopi Goldberg, like Sister Act is a kind of mythology. I think that the other thing I wanted to say was that, you brought up uh, this kind of Babylonian schema, or thinking about the zodiac. And it was interesting because I only just recently learned about the unicorn. I'm sorry, the Phoenix association with Scorpio, because I was thinking about Jason Hawley's Sagittarius lecture, where he talks about Capricorn and Sagittarius. Like if you think about Capricorn as the sea goat, those are the only kind of images in the zodiac that don't really actually occur in nature. Um, and then many people, I was like tweeting about this, and many people liked it. Someone brought up this unicorn uh, kind of division of Scorpio, this three image division that you kind of brought up. Um, and I thought that that was really interesting and also kind of strange, because I don't know that I would necessarily associate I keep saying the unicorn.
You want to say it's unicorn for some reason? That's fascinating.
I
But go
don't
on.
know why. I think because they were talking, this person also talked about another sign having the unicorn associated with it. But
Okay,
um
but the
yeah, I
Phoenix.
guess I guess Phoenix kind of does make sense in association with Scorpio, if we do think about Scorpio psychologically as a transformational place, although I don't know where the Phoenix kind of comes
I
from.
think it's from Pluto. I think,
Hmm.
in the 20th century, when we started to collapse the idea of house with planet with sign,
Hmm. It's kind of
and
natural
we
zodiac kind of thing.
mhm,
Yeah.
and when we started to talk about regeneration, I think the natural imagery of the Phoenix surfaced. I don't think that was much of a popular idea
Hmm.
related to the Scorpion
Hmm.
before the 20th century. Now, someone like Christopher Renstrom might be able to point out I'm wrong,
Hmm.
but I I'm not inclined to think that maybe at best the late 19th century.
Hmm.
But before that, I can't recollect any traditional texts other than maybe mentioning the eagle,
Hmm.
and then mentioning the scorpion, and maybe I think I've seen the snake related to it.
Hmm.
But again, that feeds into this a similar theme, especially with the snake, because it molts its
Right,
skin.
sheds its skin.
It sheds
Yeah.
its skin. So I think that may have also by extension become like this idea that one goes through various transformations.
Hmm.
And there may be something to it. I mean, one of my I have some early heroes in my life, people who really changed my psychology as a kid. One of them is Superman, and anyone who knows me, like, oh yeah, you're big into Superman. That's
Hmm.
I won't go into that. But the other one is Doctor Who,
Hmm.
the British TV series, one of the longest TV series on the air.
Hmm.
And one of the fascinating things is that this doctor, I mean, that he regenerates, right?
Mm.
So he has, in order to kind of justify having a new actor who becomes the doctor,
Uh-huh.
um, the doctor goes through these different regenerations, and initially it was that he only had, the possibility of 12 regenerations.
Hmm.
They've now extended it. I think he's in his fourth regeneration, or 14th, sorry,
Hmm.
his 14th regeneration. Um, so, I think if we go along with a scorpionic image, it really spoke to me,
Hmm.
and spoke to my ninth house sun, because he travels in a
Mm.
TARDIS through time to various places. And that became very provocative for me at a time where I needed it. It was roughly around 10 years old.
Mm.
Um, I didn't always do well academically. I mean, I was dealing with a lot of Martian issues, fighting a lot.
Mm.
not realizing I was really bored in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And John Pertwee's Doctor Who, seeing this, British guy, kind of, what do you call it? Foppish,
Mm-hmm.
doctor, right? Very
Yeah.
proper, but traveling through time and helping people. I don't know, that became an archetypal typal image, a Time Lord, right?
Mm.
That word, especially since I've become an astrologer, I'm very aware of.
Mm-hmm.
That really motivated me.
Mm-hmm.
It stimulated me, and I think it was part and parcel to me developing an interest, or at least tolerance, for school
Mm.
enough to start doing well in it. So that there is something near. I don't know if, yeah, I'm not going to embrace Pluto as the ruler of Scorpio. I think that's a different conversation, but
Yeah.
I think that's kind of part of its imagery.
Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, and I mean, maybe there is a time and place for the conversation about rulership, but I mean, throughout this podcast, I've been focusing on like quote unquote traditional rulerships rather than modern rulerships. So we'll just say that, we're taking for granted that Mars is the ruler of Scorpio. Um, I think most people who listen to this podcast probably are
Of a
of the
similar
same
mind.
opinion,
Mhm.
or, students of Hellenistic or pre-modern astrology. So I don't think we have to get into it too much. One of the things that you brought up that was interesting, related to another little note I had in our document, was that you don't take in the kind of elemental or the seasonal kind of consideration too much because you feel like it's limited. But I think it is interesting, the kind of associations with autumn and death, um, and the connection that the sun can have in certain astrological traditions with this tension between it being, the thing that we revolve around and the thing that gives us life, but also being a malefic. Um, like we can't get too close to the sun. We can't stare at the sun for too long. Unlike the moon, we can kind of look at all night long. And so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about the sun's nature in relation to it being a luminary, but it sometimes getting these other associations.
Sure. I think there's no doubt, considering where Western astrology, what we now call Western astrology, developed, in terms of Alexandria or
Mm-hmm.
Babylon, in terms of the Mediterranean rim. There's no doubt that it informs the nature of how we generally talk and think about astrology.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that becomes true in the Southern Hemisphere is
Mm-hmm.
still up for debate. You
Yeah.
know, there are some astrologers who are taking more and more issue with it, even
Mm-hmm.
though I've heard from other astrologers in the Southern Hemisphere who said, like, an Aries is in Aries, whether we're talking about the spring equinox, being like the conduit into like warmer climes
Mm-hmm.
or colder climes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or in times. But where I think is uniform is that there's a change of light. So,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, I don't think we were dealing with the same notions of foliage and changes of foliage in parts of the Mediterranean world as we're dealing, in more northern temperate zones,
Mm-hmm.
even though that
Yeah.
still is kind of temperate relatively. So I think there is a change, but there's definitely a change of light.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are losing more light as the sun goes into Scorpio. It has already started at the tipping point with the sun in Libra coming from the equinox, the
Right.
autumnal equinox. So I think we're definitely dealing with darkness
Mm-hmm.
kind of having more encroaching power.
Yeah.
And by virtue of that, and then, for those who were more toward the north, experiencing the change in temperature and maybe in foliage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that does tap into some measure of the notion of, the Martian quality of needing to preserve protect and defend, but it's not defense just singularly against some mortal human foe, but the coming assaults of nature.
Right. All right, wonderful. Any additional kind of thoughts about what the sun means for you in Scorpio?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking, a lot about over time, my dive into Scorpio, you know, I mentioned relates to that astrologer, but I think a lot about um what he said.
Mm.
And what he said, again, specifically, is that your brother, father were involved in some kind of, I didn't explain it this way, but trauma that my mother experienced during her
Mm.
pregnancy with me.
Mm.
So part of that focus becomes my brother.
Okay.
And why he becomes important, and his birthday was on Tuesday, the 24th.
Mm-hmm.
So he's at the very beginning of Scorpio. He's
Right.
0 degrees Scorpio. I'm 29 degrees 45 minutes of Scorpio. We both have similar aspects of Scorpio, like remaining
You
before one
bookend the sign, yeah.
bookends.
Mm-hmm.
And why that's important, my resistance, I believe, to being a Scorpio was that I was different, very different in temperament and quality than he was,
Mm-hmm.
or at least I thought so.
Yeah.
So he has this very brooding sense of quality that he really kind of he would step into. He's no longer with us, but
Mm-hmm.
even when he was younger, my mom would tell me stories like before I was born,
Mm-hmm.
how he just couldn't let some injustice stand, and he would want to get even, all these different things. And I was like, that fucking Fabian, and that's his name, Fabian. I was like, oh, what an idiot.
You mentioned also that he's an Aries rising with the moon in the
Mm-hmm.
first, so it does it's like very martial person
Right.
and very kind of that's all right there, very visible in the vehicle to kind of allude back to.
And his Mars is in Gemini. So it was very different for
Mm.
me than my
Mm-hmm.
Mars in Capricorn, which is a lot
Mm-hmm.
more methodical, a lot
Right.
more thoughtful in that
Mm-hmm.
sense. But as I've come to think about the movement of the sun through signs, there's one particular Czech astrologer, I'm blanking on his name, who's argued that it's pretty much from there's a wave.
Mm-hmm.
Like you actually have some more of the sign more toward the end, going from the middle to the end, then you have it as we expect in the beginning.
Okay.
Whether one wants to buy that or not.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think about with him is that I think we have to think of these sun movements as maybe a wave,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where we have maybe even crests and falls and then crests again, as ways where we understand dimensions of the traits often associated with the sign.
Mm-hmm.
And using the analogy I gave, I have found that if we're talking about the essence of Scorpio,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote, being those traits related to the quote unquote signology of it, I actually sometimes find that the moon and the rising sign, maybe in that order, might manifest more of those traits than the sun. I think the sun has a certain inconstancy.
Yeah.
I don't always feel like, I'm not always identified as a Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
But when I meet someone who has a moon in Scorpio, I'm like, there she is.
Yeah.
Like, it's there.
Mm-hmm.
There's no
Mm-hmm.
question that moon is in Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, I think even a Scorpio rising might reflect more of that. I don't know if that's always true pre-Saturn return, because I think the rising sign becomes more manifest at or post the Saturn return. But
Oh,
that's just
interesting.
my thought.
Yeah. It's interesting thinking about like the hidden nature of the soul if we associate the sun with the soul, and
Mm-hmm.
how like we cannot, I mean, I guess you could deny the fact of our embodiment, but if we associate the moon with the body, um it's very like, you know, it's immediate, our experience of someone else's body. If we associate the rising sign with the personality or what have you, it's very immediate. But the soul or the spirit is something that is a little bit more uh indiscernible or what have
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
those are some closing thoughts I would have related to the sun, with your question. But yeah, it's interesting because like I said, I haven't always felt like a Scorpio. But
mhm,
the older I've gotten, the more I do feel like there are some traits of Scorpio that are very strong.
yeah.
I don't feel the vengeful quality. I definitely in relationship haven't experienced or exhibited a lot of the jealous
Mhm,
qualities that usually people associate with Scorpio.
mhm.
But passionate, I mean, you've seen me on Twitter or you whatever. Like if you get me on the right topic on the wrong day, it's
Mhm.
like, you know, it's like it may sound like I'm trying to extract your soul from you.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can relate in my own ways with my own sun. I think being a Capricorn sun and like the kind of sun sign associations that are made with that, that was like something I didn't want to be, you know. I didn't want to be associated with that. Like and it also felt very, even the positive things felt kind of reductive. Like, okay, I'm really hardworking and like always on my grind. Like, okay, like the one, that's not really that true all the time. And then two, there's a lot more to my personality, I think, than that. And so yeah, it's interesting thinking about my own rising and moon in Sagittarius, and then it's like, yeah, how is the moon, if the moon reflects the light of the sun, how is the moon reflecting that Capricornian light? Or for you, with your moon, how is the moon reflecting that kind of scorpionic light of the sun?
Yeah, and what's interesting, especially when you if you share my chart again,
Mm-hmm.
is to kind of realize that there is a connection between my moon and sun by Antisha,
Oh, okay.
by contra Antisha, but even by Antisha in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's a tacit reflection of one to the other. Um, but yeah, I think that's important to think about. Yeah, so you're about to show it, and I guess you can go to if you go to your other tab, I guess you could reflect on the Antisha. There it
Mm.
is up
There
there,
we
or
go.
contra Antisha.
Hide aspect lines. I'm like,
Yeah.
sometimes these are very complicated.
So you could see that, it kind of the moon then opposes it in that sense, because the moon is on the outer ring, I think, there
Mm-hmm.
to the sun.
Yeah, there we go. You got the sun there and the moon here.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's one way to start thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Cool. Yeah, and how do you think about Antisha and contra Antisha, like as a connection
so
between your sun and moon?
I think about, as literally means shadow point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more another way in which there's a connection that isn't completely visible.
Mm.
It's the subterranean aspect of your chart.
Yeah.
And the analogy that I give, especially for you being in Nueva York, is
Mm-hmm.
that you can think of the traditional aspects as the subway system, but
Mm.
real New Yorkers, you even alluded to it a little bit, know about the buses,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they can get cross town if we're talking about like Manhattan, but this
Yeah,
is
from
true for all the boroughs.
Brooklyn to Brooklyn.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's true for all the boroughs, but especially it
Mm-hmm.
becomes useful in Manhattan because most tourists only stay in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so buses become, like we talked about, Antisha and contra Antisha, ways in which we are able to make connections that are not as visible.
Mm. I love that. That's awesome.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Um, yeah, anything else about the sun in the ninth or where Scorpio falls in your chart?
Well, if we didn't, because we didn't mention the joys, right? I mean, it's
Right.
kind of
Would love
more
to hear your
like, so
thoughts
the
on that.
sun, joys, I just think, because some people get confused about like, well, is that an accidental dignity? Kind of, but kind of not, in the sense that it's not an accidental dignity as being in the 10th or being, conjoined to Regulus or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it does, the joy reflects an additional commentary of disposition.
Mm-hmm.
So my sun is in Sect, right? In terms
Right.
of being a day chart and being, depending on which kind of system you want to use, being above the horizon
Mm-hmm.
and being in the 9th house, it's joy. I think it's a matter of disposition where it has a certain relish.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, we could think of accidental dignity along with the aspect of joy as a happy-go-lucky person who enjoys meeting people, who ends up working at McDonald's, who works at the counter.
Mm-hmm.
Now you may say like, okay, that's the accidental dignity. That's true. So who's a morning person and gets the morning shift.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then they're really on, as versus
Yeah.
the afternoon shift where there's might be a little lag, but they're still perky,
Mm-hmm.
or evening shift where they're still moderately perky, but not as happy and they're sleeping and
Mm-hmm.
not as quick on it. But
Mm-hmm.
morning, like, good morning, welcome to McDonald's. How can I
Yeah.
help you? Blah, blah, blah. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's like my son being in its joy is kind of like, well, give me the philosophy,
Right.
give me the deeper aspects of it. That's what I really
Mm-hmm.
enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, now I understand if someone had talked to me about the philosophy behind geometry when I was in school,
Mm-hmm.
either in grade school or high school, geometry would have been a lot more interesting.
Yeah,
But
I think so
learning
too.
something without any philosophical basis
Mm-hmm.
or deeper meaning, I'm like, who cares? Why am I
Yeah.
learning this?
Like, really, what is the point of this?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's just that, if we think about a house, the location of a planet by house, and needing that planet needing to use those topics to kind of do what it wants to do or do what it does. There are certain planets that like using certain topics, like the sun likes using the philosophy and religion and all of those things, to kind of go about doing what what it's tasked with doing in your chart.
Right. I mean, the sun is the illuminator. So
Mm-hmm.
it enjoys illuminating things that, the 9th house classically is the house of dreams.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where we experience, you know, illumination related to our dreams,
Mm-hmm.
prophecies, where we get a broader outlook. So that's what the sun enjoys doing. Kind of being, you know, in the 3rd house may not be, I don't think we've created an antithesis to one's joys, but that's the house of the goddess, which is not the
Mm-hmm.
house of the god. Or so
Yeah.
it's kind of like, you want me to do tedium?
Mm-hmm.
Quotidian things? Why? Like, what
I
is that?
I think they actually do this in Jyotish, and I forget what it's called. I think it's called MKS, Mara Karatha Sathana or something like that. But it's like the kind of, I talked to Astrologer about it. It's kind of like this idea of anti-joy. And actually Rob Hand had an article on astro.com about George Bush, where he talks about George Bush's 12th house sun. And it's like this kind of thing of like, you don't want the sun in the 12th. So it's like not necessarily like and then he talks about how the sun operates, like how can this person be a president having the sun in the 12th, kind of thing. But
Yeah, but
um
that, it's an interesting, I mean, I teach George's chart.
mm-hmm.
What's interesting is George's chart, I mean, he's a sun in Cancer, um, with a Jupiter, oh, a Jupiter in, okay, wait, let me just remember this. But he has a mutual reception.
I'm like, ooh, I can share screens and stuff now. So let's see if we
So
could find.
let's get George's chart up because um he has a mutual reception that explains, I think, how he became president, because that's actually something I do talk about with my students.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that paved the way for it. Like if he could get to a 12th house situation, which he did,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he could become president.
Yeah, let me
So
share this real
you have it?
quick.
Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so his moon is going toward a conjunction to Jupiter, and he has Sun and Saturn in the 12th house. Well, one,
Right.
he has Sun conjoined to the fixed star Sirius, which is already
Mm-hmm.
powerful itself.
Mm-hmm.
He broadly has Jupiter opposing his midheaven, or Jupiter conjoined to his IC.
Mm-hmm.
So Saturn has, we could say it's Y, but still it's there because it's a cohabitant of the 12th house.
Mm-hmm.
Saturn has mixed mutual reception with Jupiter.
Mm-hmm. By
So
exaltation, yeah.
by exaltation. And what that really reveals, that it's not even mixed, it's just by exaltation.
Mm-hmm.
And what that actually reveals is that with Jupiter being so close to his IC, that if he could get in a 12th house situation, his Jupiter father could benefit him. Well, how did it happen?
Mm-hmm.
Well, his father had got in a conservative justice named Clarence Thomas, who became one of the deciding votes on whether one could have Chads, in the 2000 election.
Right.
And he became president.
Mm-hmm. Because the Supreme Court decided it. Yep.
There it is. So I've always thought that's been interesting. So, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the great Rob Hand because, I highly venerate him. But I think, it does explain some dimension of this 12th house, how it fared, even though it rules his first. And I mean, George is W is a fascinating case study because of his brothers, and of the people, I think even his mother and father thought would be president, he wasn't it.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that he did what his father couldn't do. He got 2 terms.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and
HW only got 1. Yeah.
Right. And Jeb didn't even get in the running.
Yeah, it's interesting because Jeb does seem more of the like kind of quote unquote mainstream Republican candidate, but it's like, yeah, he just came at the wrong time.
Came at the
a
wrong
time when
time.
that was not wanted.
But I mean, W persevered. I mean, yeah, we could go on about his chart because, like I said, it's fascinating with Mercury conjoined to his ascendant. A lot of people,
Right.
including myself at the time, I don't know if you would remember, thought W was just straight up dumb.
Right. Yeah. Couldn't speak. He has all these verbal gaffes.
But I actually think he's not Clinton-esque intelligent, but I think he's more intelligent than he comes off. He can code switch. I mean, one thing that's fascinating about him with his Mercury, if he's up north or talking to more northern folks, he knows how to talk to them. Because you can see he was born, when his father and mom, I guess, were when he was at Yale, in New Haven, Connecticut. But when he gets to other parts of the country, like more of the South or the West or Southwest, considering he also grew up in Texas, he can sound as folksy as whatever. Yeah. He also has a photographic memory. It doesn't come up, in terms of remembering words, but he remembers faces and names extremely well.
Yeah, there's that famous saying of him, which I'll probably butcher, but he's like, there's a famous saying in Tennessee. I know it's in Texas. Maybe it's in Tennessee. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, can't get fooled again. Which is not how the saying goes.
It's not the saying. Yeah, his he like I said, he's famous for his gaffes, but he I think he has remarkable social skills, which I think is what helped him kind of climb toward the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, he famously basically became president because of his dad, but also because of where he went to Yale. He was in these kinds of societies.
Yeah, Skull and Bones.
He was connected,
And speaking as a contrast, because to stay on point, and then I know we're going to go to something else. Look at his moon. His moon is in the 3rd, going toward a conjunction with a benefic, right? So it's in, he may not have the strong sun, but that sun defers to the moon, and the moon is in her joy.
Yeah. And to speak to how he got onto this, Saturn is also in the house of its joy in the 12th. So
that's also true. Yeah,
we have this chart with 2 planets in houses where they're joying.
So it's 3. Mercury's also in
her joy. Yeah, I always forget about Mercury in the 1st. There we go. Yeah, amazing. Okay, Let's see where we are. Okay, would you like to share about your Mars placement and how
Sure.
that, yeah, how that, I know you already said that it's in Capricorn, which is your not your 12th, is it?
No, it's my 11th.
Your 11th. Yeah, so how does that kind of give a different flavor to the way that your sun manifests?
Um, with stamina,
Mm,
determination. But what's weird from the inside out, I don't think of it as stamina and determination. Let me explain.
hmm
You probably have done research on this or know that there's a good number of successful astrologers who have Mars in Capricorn.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I
I
mean
know you and Chris Brennan.
Ray Merriman.
hmm
Um, there's a couple others I can think of who have, the Mars in Capricorn. And how I think about it is like can't stop, won't stop,
Yeah.
right? And it's not so much like, oh, I'm going to show them wrong
hmm
and prove myself right. It's more like there may be some dimensions of that, especially influenced by Scorpio, but I think another dimension of it is just kind of like we're here for the long march.
hmm
Um and I always encourage, one of the concerns, going back to something that you talked about, one of my concerns about what Rob talked about, because I've heard of him talk about it in person,
hmm
with the Mercury and its relationship to the lot of fortune, because not just by conjunction, but rulership,
Right.
you know, a lot of
11th
people.
from Fortune. Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
few different things.
yeah.
hmm
One of my concerns and recoils was it discouraging people from thinking they could have a career in astrology,
hmm
which is lamentable. And it sounded like to me, even how people talk about the astrologer's degree.
hmm
There's a, CEO Carter mentioned that there is, a degree that he has found, a degree of the zodiac where many astrologers had it. I think it's something like 26 degrees Leo or 27 degrees of Leo. I don't have that,
hmm
right? And one could then look at that and be like, well, maybe I'm not going to have a career as an astrologer. And I think that's
Right.
bunk,
Yeah.
right? I think what becomes the real measure, whether you have a Mars in Capricorn or not, of your success in astrology is your determination. And I think ultimately we could say even your love of astrology.
Mm-hmm.
Love astrology for herself,
Right.
right? Not for what it gets you, not
hmm
for the fans, not for the money,
Yeah.
but Urania will reward you with the love that you give to her. And Urania is one of the names for the Graces, not fucking Uranus,
hmm
right? Um, and I think, with Mars and Capricorn, I think of Capricorn, Mars particularly, as the tinkerer, the relentless curiosity to figure out how do things work.
mm
And the person I think about with this is Goethe,
mm
Johann Goethe, who also had Mars in Capricorn.
Okay.
Not only was he playful with language, because we know him for Faust and for his plays and his literature, but he's also someone who, was into chemistry and really trying to understand how things work.
hmm Polymath, if you will.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think Mars and Capricorn directs me to kind of more into the working of things.
mm
Um, and then being in the 11th house, it does mean some practical things. Some of my best friends have been people I initially fought with, right?
Yeah.
Met in Mars circumstances.
hmm
It doesn't necessarily lead for me to contentious relationships with people who I deem my friends.
mm
That was true for um Robert Zoller, who had
Yeah.
Mars in the 11th.
Okay.
But I think he has Mars in Aquarius in the 11th.
hmm
So I think, or maybe sad, but it was some way in which he experienced that. It's not been my experience. I tend to, like Gabe Rosas gave me a compliment recently in terms of talking about on a CV Henriette's show. Art of the Zodiac,
Mm-hmm.
he said of me that, you know, I emphasize building community.
Mm.
And I think that's largely true. I mean, my Mars in the 11th house has been championing for community, you know,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of broadening it, have it be reflective of our world in
Mm-hmm.
terms of diversity,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're talking about, you know, people by race, again,
Mm-hmm.
gender or class.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then also to think about how we create this sense of continuity and community. So that's where my passion has really manifested.
Mm. Yeah, and if we think about Mars as just generally the planet of action, it's like we can look to Mars's placement to say, you know, where are you kind of called to take action?
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, it's like I know that all you've done with NORWAC and the diversity scholarships and stuff with that, and how that's enabled people to be able to go there, and I know you've done a lot of different things with kind of community, quote unquote, in general.
Yeah,
So that
ESAR
makes a
being
lot of
involved in the
sense.
group.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was on the ESAR board for 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very much being attentive to the sense of community and organization.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to what I was saying, I mean, I think it also gives a sense of stamina. And I think that's important because I'm about to say something controversial. In this age and time where people are very much into cancel culture, you
Mm.
know, I'm going to cancel you because you said something I don't like.
Mm-hmm.
What I like to say to all those folks is that, you know, bitch, I will outlast you. I will
Mm.
outrun you because all you have is outrage. You don't have stamina.
Mm.
So you can come with your outrage, but how long are you going to keep it? My
Yeah.
outrage, I work with that rage every day.
Mm.
And that prompts me to get up, do what I have to do, and get done. But if you're only with your, you know, short-term outrage, how long are you going to be in the game?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Note to everybody that wants to pick a fight with Scorpio placements.
It's true. I
Yeah.
mean, we know of a Scorpio who someone picked a fight with the Scorpio and they had a 7-hour podcast. Fuck around, find out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very true.
So it's it's I think that Mars and Capricorn, that that sense, it's not just about quote unquote vengeance, because some
Mm-hmm.
people like want to talk about Scorpio and the stinger.
Mm-hmm.
I think the stinger is this aspect of a catalytic agent, and either that
Mm-hmm.
catalytic agent is infusing something with poison
Mm-hmm.
or something that could give life.
Right. Mm.
So, you know, at its best, the Mars placement can give some measure of where we can honor giving life,
Mm-hmm.
something that's aphetic, right,
Mm.
rather than anoretic.
Mm.
So it gives life. An anoretic, where people hear anoretic degree, that means, you know, going toward death,
Mm-hmm.
right, or giving death.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where we can make a decision. I
Mm.
mentioned my brother earlier, who was a double Aries rising moon and rising in Aries with his Mars in Gemini. So I feel like my brother's highest best destiny was to be a speed racer and to
Mm.
be a car racer as he wanted to be. But my parents talked him out of it. So
Mm.
he ended up living out that Mars with various different jobs in different Martian permutations,
Mm.
um, being a truck driver for Pepsi, you know, shipping around and traveling, you know, delivering Pepsi
Mm-hmm.
and Pepsi goods. Then for a time after that, he then was a driver for Hertz, you know,
Mm-hmm.
moving rental cars around.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, he worked with the police department in terms of community engagement, Mars in the third,
Mm-hmm.
but moving about still. And then he was a security guard toward the end of his life.
Mm.
And again, being peripatetic between different hospitals, you know,
Yeah.
but none of them were as fulfilling as what he wanted to do in terms of racing cars.
Mm.
So I think the Scorpio, you know, as funneled through its Lord,
Mm.
Mars, feels the obligation, necessity, right?
Mhm.
Ananke, where we are directed toward the fulfillment of its Lord.
Mm.
Now it's a lot more complicated than that. We can get into the parameters of the daemon, but I
Right.
think that also should come with deep contemplation for the Scorpio, not just Scorpio, but where's your Mars?
Mhm.
Because Mars and Libra is going to be different.
Yeah.
Uh, Mars and Scorpio for like, I think this is public, my sister Kira, right? Completely different
Yeah,
than the
absolutely.
experience of the Mars and Capricorn,
Mhm.
right? So,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I have like my lot of spirit in Scorpio. I have Mars and Sag, so it's like even that's a different kind of
mhm.
experience. Yeah. Wonderful. Sam, I do think we have to wrap up. So before we go, I wanted to ask if you had any suggestions for people that are new to astrology or planetary relationship in forming or initiating a relationship with the sun. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say because we've had some great like moon suggestions, but you're the first sun guest. So,
Um, well, I believe in, you know, greeting the sun.
mm,
One thing that was fascinating for me, I'm not encouraging anyone toward a particular religion, but I'm using this as analog. Um, I'm Muslim by practice in idea. Um, and what I have found is that there's an analog between the 5 prayers that Muslims are encouraged to do or to make
mhm,
in relation to the movement of the sun.
mm,
So before the sun comes up is the first prayer, which is called Fajr. And then, in terms of the second prayer, Dur is just as it goes into the ninth house
mm,
for your wherever you are, especially if you're using a quadrant-based system. Maybe a
mhm,
little different to see it with whole sign houses. And then as it's going toward, you know, the the afternoon, the waning sun, it's Asr, which means literally loss. So
mhm.
that's the sun in the eighth house.
Okay.
And then as the sun is going toward its, sunset, that's Maghrib. So that's the fourth prayer. And then
Mhm,
as it, so as it's going from seventh into the sixth,
mm,
and then once it's solidly in the sixth and maybe even going toward the fifth, it is in the last prayer. So for the last prayer for the day, that's where you you are, releasing.
mm,
And I think that that practice of kind of tracking the sun has really, because that's how we even have primary motion,
right.
really puts us in touch with how we understand the houses,
Mhm,
and then also have how we have illumination during the day.
yeah.
So I think that becomes a way of starting to honor the sun in your life and its potency.
Mhm,
But for me, it was coming through um prayer.
okay.
Um, like like with the sun has descended into that last prayer, Isha, which I didn't mention my name is Isha.
Mhm,
It's kind of more so where you're releasing the day, and actually technically for Muslims a new day has begun because
right.
we go by sunset to sunset.
Mhm,
Okay. And I think that becomes important. Another way to think about days, motion is planetary hours.
mm,
You don't have to just do it on Sunday, right? It can be just observing what is the nature of an hour and what it, how it imbues energy into a planet
right.
or a time frame.
Mhm,
If you're into yoga, then there's the asana related to Surya, right? In
mhm,
terms of greeting the Surya salutation.
right.
I think that is important. And then, things related to the sun, colors,
Mhm,
fragrances,
mhm,
you know, and there's various sources for that. Whether you decide to go on skyscript.co.uk and look up, what are the significations, things related to the sun.
mhm,
And I would encourage people in general to get in touch with the planets. I mean, a lot of people think it's about the sign, but it's the sign that gives us the coloring related to the planet. So we're talking about the
mhm.
sun in Scorpio, but it also becomes related to the ruler, Mars,
Yeah.
and its inner dimensions.
Mm, wonderful. Thank you for that. Anything else you want to add, or any imparting thoughts about the sun before we go?
I don't. Let me see if you gave me a nice little list of things. The contemplate. No, I don't know if I have anything else related to the sun. I am intrigued by a question we didn't cover. What made you ask about Virgo? The experience of the sun and the sign of Virgo.
That was just a typo. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what was fascinating about that, right? And I thought you were going there, is that the glyph for Virgo does look like the glyph for Scorpio, right?
Indeed, it does. Yeah.
Except that the glyph, the tail.
We got a fish instead of a
right
a hook.
tails in it. Yeah.
Tail.
So I think about the idea. There is a connection because there is this idea that Libra is a new sign. And Libra is kind of like a breaking off of parts of Scorpio, which technically is true. The claws of the Scorpion becomes the scales of Libra. But it's almost as if like Virgo and Scorpio were kind of right next to it, and Libra kind of became in between. I don't know if that is actually as historically accurate as we would want it to be. But I thought for a minute that you were going there, and I thought that was interesting in terms of that there is a similarity by virtue of their, I won't say their genders because I try to break away from gender, but their natures. Both are earth, water, receptive, but there's different ways in which they do it. Their receptivity, mercurial versus also martial.
Fixed versus mutable. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because to go back to Jason Hawley's Sagittarius lecture, the original image for Sagittarius had a scorpion's tail. And there's this kind of idea of Sagittarius used to be like in, Scorpio and Sagittarius used to kind of be like conglomerated together as well. So there's an interesting evolution of all these different things.
And Sagittarius is kind of badass because they're only sign that has a weapon.
Yeah. Yeah.
No other sign has a weapon.
That's interesting to think about. Sam, is there any where can we find you, and is there anything that you're working on that you'd like to?
So people can find me at unlockastrology.com. They can find me on the interweb, specifically on Instagram at S as in Sam, F as in Fred Reynolds, SF Reynolds. On Twitter, they can find me for now at Unlock Astrology. So that's all one word. I'm in the second week. This might air sometime after that, but I'm in the second week of a beginner's course. So if it does air next week or so, there'll be the third week, which is the last week if people could sign up. They're interested in signing up.
What date is that?
So that would be the 4th. So or the 5th, of November. But yes, I have a beginner's course that started on the 22nd. And so we meet on Sundays. So if they want to sign up for that, that's at unlockastrology.com, and then under group classes, under Learn Astrology. Let me see. In May, I am going to be going to Alaska and help to lead a cruise with some other spiritual healers and seers in Alaska just before Norwalk. And then of course there's Norwalk. In 2024 near Memorial Day weekend. And that's it for now.
Okay, wonderful.
I'm always doing something.
Yeah, and it's wild. It's October, end of October, and Norwalk tickets are already live. So get your Norwalk. selling well. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. I'll be sure to link all that in the show notes. Pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and experience.
Thank you,
really
SP.
Appreciate it.
And say hello to New York for me.
I will do. Will do. I'll wave hi to the Brooklyn Bridge tomorrow for you.
All right.
Cool. Take care.
Bye-bye.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at spallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks for listening to the show. I'll see you next time.